Hi, everyone. Welcome. They asked me to MC today, and they said it was going to be a small breakfast. So it's funny being in person with these things because I'm so used to talking into a screen and just not having to see this many people. So as podcasters, it's a bit tough. But I'm really excited today because I think branded podcasts are a big part of the podcast space. I think there's so many cool messages that we can tell, and brands can get a lot of mileage out of what you can do with that. And I'm going to kick off by telling you about who we're going to see today and who's going to be up here speaking. So we have, right after this is Tom Webster, who he did his awesome keynote yesterday, but he has a few extra slides for us about reaching the unreachable. So digging into how branded podcasts can help the space, what we know about it. Dave Beasings of Sound That Brands will be moderating a panel. And it will be all about inside Trader Joe's and how successful that podcast has been. We have Chris Albert from National Geographic and Mary Melton from Microsoft. And they're two of the biggest brands in the space doing branded podcasts. So it'll be really great to hear from them. And, sorry, my notes and my glasses. So funny on this. I genuinely am excited about this, right? Everything I do is about ad tech, and we think about ads as sometimes invasive things. We talk about skipping them, and branded podcasts are ads, right? They're an extension of it, but there's something that shows that it's content. There's something that shows that people are really passionate about engaging with new and interesting things that appeal to them. And so when we look at an ad and we talk about, can someone skip it? And then we're sitting here all interested in talking about branded podcasts, which a download means that someone listened to something that's kind of like an ad for 30, 60 minutes or a whole series. It's really powerful. So I'm going to stop rambling on that end, and I'm going to pass it off to Tom Webster of Edison Research, who's going to do a little bit better than I am at this.
And I'm sorry I'm a bit late. I had one more batch of bacon to cook, but I just got it out of the oven. And I hope you're enjoying the breakfast that I made for you this morning. It means a lot. So at Edison Research, we do a lot, obviously, to track the podcasting space. I'm sure you've seen some of our data. We also do a lot of brand lift research in both the branded podcast space and in brand advertising in general. And I'm going to show you the results of one of those studies. And of course, it's going to go up. Right? I'm going to show you an A and a B, and the B is going to be better than the A, and you're going to go, okay, great. But I also want to tell you why it works, and why it's important, and why branded podcasts in particular are really vital to the space. We did, just a couple of months ago, a study in partnership with Ad Results Media called the Super Listener Study. It's our third annual Super Listener Study, and it's a project where we survey the heaviest listeners to podcasts, the people who listen to more than 5 hours a week. They're in those kind of top two quintiles. And we talk to them about advertising and sponsorship and their relationship with the medium and with other media as well in terms of advertising, because they're really the canary in the coal mine. They're the people who hear the most ads, right? Because they're listening to more podcasts than anybody else. So they are the ones who are squaring the spaces and mailing the chimps and zipping the recruits and all of that that we do in podcast advertising. And a couple of things about these folks. Number one, for years and years, I've been talking about the podcast listener as an affluent target, an attractive target, people with a lot of disposable income. They've been very big for DTC. They've been very big for any number of categories. They spend a lot of money. But here's the thing that doesn't get talked about enough. They're almost unreachable. And here's why. First of all, of these super listeners, you can see almost all of them subscribe to something like Netflix or Amazon Prime, right? 94% now subscribe to any one of those, right? And those services are either commercial free or, let's say, commercial Spartan, right? There's no ads on Netflix. There may be product placement, but if they're spending all of this time watching Netflix, all of this time watching things on Amazon Prime, HBO Max, et cetera, all of these services, that's hours and hours and hours that they are essentially unreachable by traditional kinds of advertising. And the same is true with their audio consumption. Today, over 3/4 subscribe to some kind of premium audio service. And people are subscribing to these things not just for convenience and choice, but for a very important reason. For those of you in the advertising game, they don't like you very much, right? They don't love advertising. And one thing that's grown just year over year even, why do people subscribe to premium, in this case, premium audio services? That percentage to hear fewer ads is growing and growing and growing. People are turning away from kind of traditional interrupt style advertising. And when we ask these super listeners again, how important is it to you to limit your exposure to advertising? In just 1 year, that number went up 9 percentage points, right? So these are people that don't want to be interrupted. They don't want crap ads. But the same group of people, these nearly unreachable people who are spending so much time with advertising free or advertising Spartan services, they think this about podcasts: it's the best way to reach you. These are people that don't like to be advertised to, admitting that, well, okay, podcasts, I'm good with that. Now, there's a reason for this. There's a why behind all of this, and the why for it is older than podcasting itself. In fact, it goes back to a study that was published in the Journal of Advertising Research back in the early 2000s on something called true sponsorship. Now, there are certainly advertisements which advertise a product, a brand, or a service, but a true sponsorship, and there's 20 years of research on this, is where there's really no tie between a product or a particular product or a brand or an ad message. There's simply the mention of the company that brings you that particular piece of programming that you want, right? And even in the earliest days, and this is all internet driven and not podcasting driven necessarily, you saw incredible lift, and this was some work that was done on Volvo. And the reason why all of this works, the reason why branded podcasts work is a very specific one. And it really comes back to this concept of true sponsorship. True sponsorship where there is exclusivity. There's nobody else advertising on the podcast. There's no overt ad on the podcast. There's simply, here's this great content. It's being brought to you by the folks at name the company, right? There's an emotive connection. There's no strings attached. There's no offer necessarily. And for those of us that have been in the advertising game for a long time, that might make you wince. How does this work? How could you do such a thing? But it does work, and here's why. An ad changes how you feel about a product, but true sponsorship, that which a branded podcast gives you, changes how you feel about the people who work at that company. The people who bring you this content you love can't be all that bad, right? That's the thing that it changes. And I want to close here by sharing with you some data from a study that we did for a large car brand, certainly one of the top 3 car brands. I can't name it, but I have drawn it for you. That's what it looks like. And this was a true sponsorship. This is a true branded podcast that, yes, the sponsor was named. There's no overt ad. There was no buy this truck or buy this car. None of that. Just here's this great content, fantastic show, brought to you by the people at that car, which I know you recognize what that is. That's a Lamborghini. No, I don't know what that is. And here's what they told us, right? Now, as I mentioned, it's a very, very well-known car brand. And in fact, in an unaided recall question with our national online panel, it was #1. So it's a very well-known car brand. But those who heard the podcast, that number shot up a lot more, right? So certainly that recall was there. People thought about the brand. And then we asked, can you think of a brand that you heard? Because when we talked to people about the podcast, we didn't tell them we were going to talk to them about ads. We told them that we were going to talk to them about the content. But they still strongly recalled the brand, again, because it brought them this great content. And then we asked them a number of questions, and these are really the kind of perceptual questions, I think, that change hearts and minds about a brand. You're not going to sell a car in a podcast, but you might move somebody towards thinking a little bit different about your car company. And the first 3 there, the podcast was relevant and relatable. Good job by them. I would definitely remember that this podcast featured the brand, the car brand in particular. And this podcast showed me a different side of that brand. It surprised people about the brand and about the people who work behind it. And now you know why. It's that true sponsorship angle, that no strings attached, that emotive exclusivity, all of that makes people feel differently about the brand. And the actions that they plan to take, 58% plan to search online for more information about that brand, 47% would tell a friend or family, and over a third said that they would plan to visit the brand's website to learn more And now you know why that is. And that's what's important about all of this. That's what's important about branded podcasts and why they're such a big player in the space, because they can change how people feel about the people who work behind the brands that are advertising. And that's really what podcasting's power is. Enjoy your breakfast. I'll cook more. Thank you.
The branded part's really interesting. So I did an interview with Pierre Bouvard of Westwood One that I wish I did like 6 years ago. So I used to work in attribution. I worked at Barometric, and people would be like, oh, it's only a 1% lift. And Pierre flipped it on my head and he said, well, it's a 99% branding success. And that's what these podcasts are. That's what Tom was showing you on here. That brand association is incredibly powerful. And so to continue that conversation, we have Steve Goldstein, the CEO of Amplify Media, is going to be talking with several of the podcasts that we talked about. They're going to be coming up on stage, and we're doing a panel right now. So I will pass that off to Steve, who is a great voice in the space, especially on branded podcasts.
Hi, good morning. So I come out of the radio business. At the beginning of the whole podcast thing, I think the radio people were not particularly respected by the pure play podcasters, but as the business has become more complex, there is some things about audio that I think podcasters have learned from radio. And one of the things that we've learned over the years is how to deal with brands. There is something scary happening. And that is, there are companies, podcast companies out there today pitching branded podcasts to companies, saying every company needs one of these things. They don't. They don't. And you have a card on your table, and I wrote something for a blog piece and did it in concert with Dave Beasing and Sound That Brands. And then Westwood One picked up on it, who does a lot of brand work. And they also share the notion that branded podcasts are not for everyone. And the reason that you're here at this breakfast is I think you probably intuitively understand that getting someone to download a podcast about a brand is a big lift, a really big lift. That's number one. Number two, if they don't find enjoyment or they can't find themselves within the podcast, there's no clear benefit to them, you've done damage to your brand. And I think that's going to be the critical wasteland that could happen with branded podcasts. And so there should be care and thought and rigor in the development of content, all content, especially branded content. And Tom was referring to a car company that really took the time and the care to do it right and experience the lift. But I can find you so many branded podcasts that were not listened to, not sampled, and even worse, not enjoyed. And that, I think, is the potential failing of branded podcasts. So I urge you all to be thoughtful about the content. Don't rush in. Come up with something that's important, magical, informative, something that people will actually want to listen to.
Thank you, Steve. Well said. Hey, Dave Beasing from Sound That Brands. How's breakfast? Good. Tom's a good cook. He's here at 5 this morning. So I want to thank the team from Sound That Brands. We've got Michelle Rice, who did a little shopping at Trader Joe's for those centerpieces among the long list of tasks she did for this. We have Tracy Sang, who put a lot of this together. Jason Jackson, he's over on the steel wheels there. And Rick Cummings, my partner in crime. And Craig Rossi, too, for inviting a lot of people. Rick got our parent company, Emmis, to do a little stock sale so that we could buy some bacon. And we appreciate that. So, a great panel. I want to let you hear a sample of their work in podcast form. thanks to Adori, you will also see some visuals that go with that. There you go.
Branded breakfast panel montage in 3, 2.
I'm Stacey Wilson Hunt, and joining me today on The Making of, a Nat Geo podcast, is Neil deGrasse Tyson. How are you doing? What's your life been like the last few months?
I'm just observing the unfolding of these events. It's basically an invader of our species, right?
Ron Howard.
Things would get emotional. I didn't want to keep pressing. I wasn't comfortable really doing that.
Never underestimate Opie asking you to talk about your life. Jeff Goldblum, was this your brainchild?
No, I have no. My brain has no children.
Everything we thought we knew about work has been turned on its head. Where is it all going, and is there any map to get us there? This is Work Lab, a new podcast from Microsoft. I'm your host, Elise Hugh, and I'll be joined on each episode by my trusty colleagues, Microsoft futurist Desmond Dickerson.
Greetings.
And journalist Mary Melton.
And yes, work, where we do it, when we do it, how we do it. Those are pressing questions right now. Are you ready?
Let's go inside Trader Joe's.
Here's a taste.
In the beginning, the store was not a success. In fact, it was scarily quiet.
It's a new 5-part series.
We'll take you inside a Trader Joe's tasting panel. That's where decisions get made about which products you'll find in your neighborhood Trader
Joe's. There we go. Thanks to Adori, Tony, and Jack are here for putting that together. They're doing some amazing stuff in not just matching up visuals to audio, but also making audio interactive. And we can, when we have e-commerce right there on our screens with these podcasts, branded podcasts especially, can you imagine? Well, they're doing more than imagining. They're making it happen. We really appreciate their help on that. So I got to get my bag of props. I genuinely forgot this is not a setup because these pertain to our guests. I want to bring up the folks from Trader Joe's first. As they said on the audio, a 5-part series inside Trader Joe's. These two just published their 49th episode, 48th, 49th episode. So it appears to be working. We're going to ask them why. It's an honor to have them here. You probably, looking at the head table, don't know which ones are from Trader Joe's, so I'll point them out. Tara Miller and Matt Sloan. Come on up. Anywhere down there. Yeah, sure. And you've got microphones. Good.
We're sharing.
Arguably the most listened to branded podcast series in history, and they're still going. Awesome. Mary Melton. Mary has so many jobs. Mary is the editor-at-large for Alta Journal. She is the editorial chief for Godfrey Dadich. She runs her own company, Mary Melton Media. She does a podcast. And she takes an occasional shift down at the bowling alley. She's amazing, a busy person. Mary Melton, come on up. Oh, there you are. And our next gentleman has a very impressive title. He is the EVP of Communications Worldwide and Talent Relations for National Geographic. So he knows Gordon Ramsay personally. Chris Albert, come on up, National Geographic. Cool. Do we have all the mics on stage? We're going to have to pass them around a little bit. Very good. Well, first question does go to Tara and Matt, so this works out well that you've got the mics. Trader Joe's has believed in branded content for years, content marketing. You were into content marketing when it wasn't cool, with the Fearless Flyer for many years, the newspaper that shows up in people's mailboxes. And Joe was the first editor of that, right? Am I right? Why podcasting? Why is that the next chapter in content marketing for you?
I'll go first. So the Fearless Flyer is stories about products, right? And we say we are a store of stories. Advertising is a challenging realm for Trader Joe's because it's hard to tell a good story in 30 seconds. It's hard to tell a good story in a minute. So when we thought about telling stories, we thought about a podcast. People listen to podcasts to hear a story, to understand more about something they're interested in. More?
And I'd say that this is loud, as am I. We're accustomed to failure, and we're very comfortable with failing through things to find something that works. So you mentioned it was initially a 5-part thing, and it was, why not try a podcast? It was after a bunch of other stuff, and we didn't set out to have a podcast. We set out to solve a problem first, a problem that we thought that we had, that we wanted to correct, and so we just thought we'd try it. And we thought we'd try it with no expectation of anyone listening, which sounds foolish, but we wanted to bank it as information on the record from us in a way that we could control the story to send people toward, to point them toward if they had questions, because we don't talk a lot about ourselves normally, even though it's all we do.
It's all we do. But as a company, you know, we get accused of being secretive.
Right.
We're not secretive. We'd rather show you the work by offering you products on our shelves than talk about the work.
And looking at the photos that you found of us, I know why we're secretive. It's like, we got to work on that. Those were terrible.
Yeah, you should tell us when you're going to do that.
Yeah, I
We
should
didn't
have
provide
let you
those
have
photos.
approval on that, for sure. I think that's one reason that the podcast has done so well. It's such a phenomenal brand to begin with, and it's a great podcast, but you had that pent-up demand for information about Trader Joe's. You're not out there every day putting out press releases and things. In fact, I like to say that podcasts are the new press release, and I know Mary agrees with that, and you've used it very effectively in that sense.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Let's pass the mic to Chris. I want to find out how he got into that. You can hang on to one, Tara, that's fine. Pivot was the word in 2020, and you had quite the pivot, and I'm not talking about your golf swing, into podcasting. Tell us about that.
Of course. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm a very big fan of your podcast, so passing mics feels very COVID safe as well. So,
I hope so.
So our podcast is really different, I think, from the others up here, which is ours is not a consumer-facing podcast. Ours is for a very specific niche audience, which is Emmy voters. And it was a real pivot. You know, National Geographic, everybody knows National Geographic, but it's been around for 133 years. But when it comes to the premium television streaming content business, the type of content we're making is relatively new for us. Award-winning, and that's a big part of our mission. And the best way we have found to immerse voters in our content is for them to touch and feel and experience it at gatherings, events, screenings, panels. So when COVID hit, that wasn't possible anymore. The year before, we had done what they call an Emmy FYC event, for your consideration event, at the Greek Theater for 5,000 people, where we had Morgan Freeman and Alex Honnold from Free Solo, and the voters got to interact with them, and it was a really successful event, and every show we featured there got at least one Emmy nomination. When COVID hit, you couldn't do that anymore. I couldn't have an event with 5,000 people, so we were trying to figure out, well, how can we showcase our content in a unique and different way to get out what it takes to make these programs to voters? And so our team came up with the idea of doing an FYC podcast. As far as I know, it was the first one. Now everyone seems to be doing them, but you know, my team had a great idea and we really carried through with it. So it is for a very niche targeted audience. There's 22,000 Emmy voters, wow. And that's who the podcast is for.
And what are their names? It is a small audience, though. I mean, it's very, very targeted. And how did you let them know that you're doing a podcast, those Emmy voters?
Yeah, that's a great idea. In a number of ways, you know, the pieces of the campaigning that still existed were advertising and interviews and things with journalists. So
Prop number one. Prop
Yeah.
number one.
So we did a big mailer to all the journalists that cover the awards with the news about our podcast. Any paid advertising that we did for the Emmy campaign always had something in it about pushing people to the podcast. And all the talent, we were very fortunate. All the talent we asked, from Ron Howard to Gordon Ramsay to Bear Grylls to Cynthia Erivo, who starred in our Genius Aretha series, all did the podcast. They were all thrilled to do it. And they all posted on social and helped push it out themselves as well. So, it was a very targeted campaign, but we fairly successfully, I think, reached the audience it was intended for.
And it gave those people, as opposed to a consumer-facing venue, it gave them an opportunity to acknowledge people who had been important to them in the making of those shows.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this was not a podcast trying to get people to watch these shows. It was a podcast to take people behind the scenes of what it took to make these shows. So Cynthia Erivo, how many hours did she spend in hair and makeup to turn into Aretha Franklin? What was that process like? What was it like singing all those songs live? You really got to go layers beneath of what it took for her to have that performance, which was nominated for an Emmy and a SAG Award and a Golden Globe Award and many others. We lost to Kate Winslet almost all of them, and they didn't have a podcast, which is annoying, but I think that this sort of played a part in getting what it took for her to do this role, which when you watch on screen seems so seamless and that it was just natural, but it was a lot of work, and you really got to hear behind the scenes what it took for her to prepare for that role.
Things that people in the industry would be very interested in hearing. Chachi from Benstown McVeigh is in the house. There he is, co-producer of the podcast.
Fantastic partners. We obviously couldn't do it without them. I mean, we don't produce podcasts on my team, so we had a lot to learn, and it was a really, really great experience.
So I'm going to ask everybody this question, so get ready. The KPIs, the key performance indicators, no marketing discussion is complete without KPIs. What are yours?
KPIs, my favorite word. Look, our end result was, did we get a nomination for that show? That was really the end goal, and I would say about 85% of the content we featured over 2 seasons of the podcast got some type of Emmy nomination. So that was our end KPI. And we won a few too, which was nice.
Very nice. All right, Mary, I want to talk to you a little bit about lots of things. I wish we had time to talk at length with everybody here. But Mary, I want to put on the screen from your website, took a shot here. There you go. From your Godfrey Dadish site, as the editorial director for Godfrey Dadish, I'm guessing you had a lot to do with the writing of this. I love it. I'm not going to. Tom says audiobooks are big, but I won't turn this session into an audiobook by reading this to you. You can see it for yourself. You call this the new editorial. There's always been this wall since the beginning of publishing, right? A wall between church and state, between content and editorial and the sales and advertising part. Is that wall coming down? That's what I feel like you're kind of saying.
I think the wall, not to evoke this image, but is being rebuilt rather than coming down, and is being reassessed. I have decades experience in journalism, came from a very traditional journalistic background, and started working with the team at Godfrey Dadish, which is staffed by a lot of former journalists and current journalists. I'm still a writer, I'm still an editor on a quarterly publication that you mentioned, thank you, Alta. But we all have in our backgrounds storytelling, whether that's storytelling through video or storytelling through podcasts or storytelling, which was for me more traditional print media. And what we've started to see was this interest in companies who want to tell their stories, but they don't want to tell stories necessarily about themselves. So they want to tell stories that are pertinent to their mission and that are pertinent to their audiences. And it's very different than what I was more accustomed to, which was called advertorial or sponsored content when I was working in a more traditional printed form. And it's more about telling stories that will reach an audience that's very engaged, right? That's very targeted. In our case with the Microsoft work, business decision makers in particular who we're trying to reach, but also telling stories that might reach a broader audience than that. One of my best friends is a cancer researcher at USC. She listens to the podcast because she manages a lab, and she gets a lot of great information about how to manage during this particular time. So the birth of WorkLab, the podcast, came from a digital publication that we created for Microsoft called WorkLab that was to really dig into the future of work. They came to us and said, we have these extraordinary researchers and scientists on our staff, and we don't know how to tell their stories in a way that's engaging and reaches an audience because they have pertinent data that we think is really important for other people to be able to hear about, but how do we actually make that come to life? And they were so happy with the digital publication that we created a podcast for them. With anything, with the Trader Joe's podcast, with the Nat Geo, with all the podcasts I listen to, what draws me into it as a storyteller is just the intimacy of the form. Like, that I'm right in someone's, like literally in their ears, right? And I think that's one reason why, as we saw from the Edison research, that the advertising is so effective, because there's just this warmth and intimacy to it, humor or pathos or whatever it is that you're talking about. That's just a connectivity that's really special and exciting. So the new editorial, to round back to that, for us is this idea that brands do have a responsibility to pick up some of the slack also that has been created by, to be honest, the Facebook, Google decimation of advertising as a base for print media. And companies need to help tell stories that need to be told, or else we're all going to be in a lot of trouble. Honestly, with just the reality of print and media just in general right now.
I would guess that you're not measuring your success by how many people write Mary in the upper right-hand corner to get 20% off their first order of Office 365 or something, but what are the KPIs then for this podcast?
Yeah, no, absolutely very similar to what Chris said. Like, if we can reach business decision makers and help them, clients certainly, Microsoft is obviously a gigantic company that, probably most of us will have some kind of interaction with Microsoft in the next 24 hours here in this room. So if we can reach the business decision makers who need to know how to understand this unbelievably confusing time that we're living in right now and how to better manage their way through it, whatever the future of work looks like. And then certainly, if we can help them understand on occasion a little bit better, like how their products can help them to do that. But that's really not at all the intent of the podcast. And in fact, I spend a lot of time as a producer of the podcast editing out references that people make to the product, which is really a weird place to be in when you're working with a major corporation. But they actually don't want us to be pitching teams and pitching the product. They really want us to be talking about the bigger issues that we're all thinking about right now.
So, Matt and Tara, the KPI question. Your podcast comes out on occasional Mondays. On Tuesday, I'm guessing the CEO has you in and says, how many downloads? How many downloads? No? How do you measure success?
We don't really analyze according to data like the way most people do. We see the downloads, and Matt and I are really the only ones who pay any attention to how many downloads are happening.
It's a vanity project for us, Dave.
It really is.
Of course.
We get a lot of positive feedback. Crew members in our stores tell us they really like it. Customers tell us they really like it. We read the occasional review on the podcast apps, and sometimes they're really good for our egos, and sometimes not so much. But most of as long as we don't eat on mic, people seem to think we're okay. We just don't use any of those real analytical, data-driven tools. It's really about a feeling, and if people's feeling tends to be positive, then we're good with that.
Go ahead, Matt.
I was going to say, an old saw is that you get what you measure, and our podcast doesn't directly generate any business. Our business is in our stores. We sell groceries. So were we to measure things, it would be how sales are going, and there's this indirect connection there. So we're interested in that. We're interested in, again, I mentioned earlier about solving a problem. That problem was that we felt like in our reticent ways in our not talking about anything, most people were getting our story wrong. And we were getting increasingly bothered by that. So we wanted a way to share some things that we thought were important, to get that info out there. And so then it started to resonate with journalists, with our own people, with our crew, with customers even. And so we were measuring, if you will, some of that feedback. And that's what's sort of driven it to where it is. But we don't have... I mean, we are the advertising, but we don't have other advertising. We're not looking for things to track clicks or likes necessarily. So it's an interesting thing. There's a real theme among the three entities here, though, that we're not necessarily looking for the end game that the podcast is it. It's about other stuff.
It's yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think that's such an interesting point is, you know, the event we did at the Greek Theater cost $1 million. So there were a lot of questions. What are you getting out of it? What are your KPIs? Relatively speaking, obviously, as everyone knows, podcasts aren't free. They take money, they take engineering, they take a lot of work. But relative to the cost I was spending on something else, it wasn't nearly that much. And nobody asked me any questions about it. They said, sounds great, you should go forward and do it. And that, I think, speaks to the power of podcasts, because relatively speaking, if you're doing a TV show, that's going to cost a lot more than it is to produce a podcast. So I think it's a safe medium for the people that we all report to allow us to experiment and have fun with and do interesting things, because relatively speaking to other activities that the company is investing in, it is not as high as those investments.
The expenditure in general, people in LA know this because you see it everywhere. The expenditure on for your consideration, advertising, marketing, events, so forth, it's enormous.
I mean, it's embarrassing.
Yeah. And it's in the contracts with the talent and the producers and everybody that you're going to spend a certain amount to try to get them an award as well. Tara and Matt, at Trader Joe's, I get the sense that that same attitude towards your marketing probably prevails in other things as well. Or are you measuring specific KPIs in your video, in your Fearless Flyer, the other things?
Not so much. Really, for us, it's branding, it's brand awareness, it's brand understanding. So we feel like, as Matt said, it's a way for us to tell our story in a way that we get to control the narrative so that it's not misunderstood. There was a lot of misunderstanding about Trader Joe's and how we operate and what we do. By putting these stories out there, whether it's in the podcast or whether it's in another format, we're building our brand, and that it's not so much about selling a particular product. It's really helping folks understand who we are as a brand, and for better or worse, people who listen to the podcast really have an understanding of the brand through us, and hope, you know, we're a little silly and sometimes very silly, but we're having a good time and we're enjoying all the pieces that go along with being a Trader Joe's crew member, and hopefully that comes through.
And I think
and we get to eat.
the point about efficiency or effectiveness or low-cost models is so important. Historically, you know, back to Joe Colomb, the Joe in Trader Joe's, you know, if you go to an idea of the Dymaxion from Buckminster Fuller, you know, the most output for the least input, that's always been important for us. You know, consumer packaged goods companies might spend, you know, 12% or more of revenue on advertising or things like this. I mean, Trader Joe's historically, it's like ours isn't even a rounding error. Like, we have nothing to work with by design. That's important. And so this format, it turns out, is really effective because it's mostly just tying up our time. And although we have other jobs, I think the company looked at it as like, we don't have to pay them anything else to do this.
Yeah, because...
Well, I mean, you know, a full-page ad in the New York Times of advertising can cost $125,000. You see it that day and it goes in the recycle bin. I'm imagining you can produce many episodes for that same amount of money that live forever on all of the podcasting listening. So it is actually such an ingenious and effective tool. And I imagine when you get one tweet that says, "Oh my God, I love the Trader Joe's podcast this week," that is your measure of success. Whereas like when Ron Howard says, wow, I really appreciated being able to tell the story about why this film was important to me in this safe environment, like that is a measure of success.
Yeah, and honestly, a really fun thing that I notice happening is social media, for all of its pitfalls, other listeners promote the content more in a way that we never could. So you connect with people on a personal level, and they promote you to other people. And it's just a constant flow of that promotion by others of your own content.
You two are quoted so often in not just trade press, but everywhere, because the podcast has become the press release from Trader Joe's. Today Show, Eater, Eat This, Not That, all of those. And
all the greats, yeah.
Yes, yeah.
My mother loves when we get quoted in Real Simple. So just,
Real Simple. Mom's watching that one.
Yep.
And so this is prop number 2 or 3. The Springle Jangle from Trader Joe's, Chris. You mentioned on the most recent episode of the podcast that the walls in Claude Monet's house in France are yellow, but not this yellow, not quite this yellow. Where do you come up with this stuff? Do you prep for that?
Well, it's true. It's true, though. I mean, the walls in Monet's house are a color very similar to that.
Does that make it expensible to go to France?
That's a good idea. No, it's just, it's something that, I mean, it's, I just can't shut up about stuff, so I just kind of go, and it's this condition. But it's something that hopefully, and it made the cut. And in the spirit of candor, Dave, we work with your team to make our podcast. So sounds that brand actually helps us sound good. Just to be clear. So, keeping that kind of stuff in there does allow for some degree of armchair travel that lets people sort of in on something that the world is cool and the world should be experienced. And if it starts with tasting something you've never tasted from a place you've never been, that's great.
Story.
And that's what we'd like to have happen. And it's just goofy that, I happen to have been there and thought about that because at home we talked about painting one part of the house that color, which engendered a bunch of other stuff. But, yeah, that's real.
I have to tell you that I every time I go to Google to look for your podcast, Google tells me that I might be asking the question, apparently it's common, who are the hosts of the Trader Joe's podcast? Tell us about those people. Did you expect to be celebrities? I know that's probably not why you went to work for a grocery store.
Probably not. I'm not sure celebrity is the right word, but it's fun.
Yeah. Chris, Jeff Goldblum, I've got the list. Ron Howard, it's a partial list. Brian Grazer, Cynthia Erivo, you mentioned a lot of these folks. That is a lineup that could draw a mass audience. Have you thought about going into another realm and doing some podcasts for the general public?
The honest answer is no, not for what I do. National Geographic has a very successful podcast called Overheard that is produced out of the editorial team. I'm not the editorial team, so I strategically, in order to be able to have the freedom to do this podcast in the way we wanted, did not want anyone to think that we were trying to compete with the Overheard podcast, which is the very successful, very big consumer-facing National Geographic podcast. So no, I think ours is for the niche audience that we created it for, and that's who we will market it to and really focus on. I can understand, everyone wants to hear from celebrities, and I know people have found it and listened to it and enjoy it, and that's great, but that's not going to ever be the focus of what my team does or our area of responsibility.
Mary, working in this content marketing space so much, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. So much of what Tom showed us would lend you to believe that things are moving more and more in the content marketing direction. What are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine so. I think this is partly answer to that because I want to just build on something that Tara was saying about the reach question and a little bit more about the KPIs because it's relevant to the content marketing question. Is that when you're thinking about how to measure success with this, with podcasts or whatever, and it's always dangerous to get into the game of predictions, right? But I do see, just as a veteran of media, that this is all headed in one direction, and it's smaller, more engaged audiences, right? Like, and the phrase boutique is used a lot, right? I hear that a lot, but the importance of really building a community around your brand, your media company, your nonprofit, whatever that is, and not measuring things in masses who are spread really thin, but in a smaller group that is really eager to be engaged, to invest in your brand. And I use that word investment not just in a financial sense, but in an emotional sense, and an intellectual sense, and to come back. So when you do events, they want to engage more deeply with you, and there is a financial, possible like benefit to all of this, right? Of like really being able to have subscribers who really are invested in what you're doing, rather than just touching upon a lot. And I think the more that we see, and brands are going to be really smart to think that way of like, how do I build maybe not this gigantic audience, but this audience that's really going to invest in what we do.
Well, this has been a great discussion. We are rolling past our end time here. I want to thank you all for being here. Tara Miller, Matt Sloan, Mary Melton, Chris Albert, and let the record show that no publicity clause 14C was not violated by me in the Trader Joe's contract. But thank you for that acknowledgement. And thank all of you for coming too. Brian, thank you for emceeing. Steve, thanks for getting up there. Tom, the dad is always fantastic. Did I leave anybody out? Question? Yeah, you got time for Q&A? Okay. Go ahead. Let's do it. Yes. Stephanie? No.
There is a whole underground Trader Joe's wine group that I have now joined, and I want to thank you for that. I'm a hero to my family. As soon as the podcast comes out, I listen to it, I hear what is coming in, and I send it out to everyone that I know, and they need to go shop for whatever's in season. So I just wanted to thank you for that. I so enjoy listening to it. I love the community that you build with it and make it very neighborhoody. And so yeah, wasn't really a question, but thank you.
That was fantastic. Thank you. So there's the KPI, Dave. Jeez, crying out loud. So that's what it's about. And I mean, we have the easiest gig ever because there are lots of people who work really hard in every store, hopefully in your store, to make that happen every day. And the people who figure out how to make products and make those products go from an idea to a real package of stuff that might match Monet's walls or not. But there are lots of people who are really smart and really capable doing lots of great stuff. So it's easy for us. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I don't need to add anything.
But to what Mary said, I mean, that's the exact example of community right there.
We planted her. Just kidding.
That's what happens in our stores, though, right? So what we're doing is hopefully a reflection and a reinforcement of what goes on inside the four walls of the store every single day.
Any other questions or comments? No? Hey, there's a great convention out there for you to enjoy, but there's no rush to get out. If you want to talk to these folks, talk to each other, please stick around. I have one more prop here. The Sound That Brands Yeti mug. It is yours on the way out the door. Please, no pushing, no shoving. There are plenty of mugs. Enjoy it. We may not get together until the next branded breakfast, but we are with you every morning in spirit with your Yeti mug. Please enjoy it. And thank you again for coming. Hope breakfast was good.